Well, welcome to summer camp. You are here in our 6th year. This is our 6th year of WeWick Summer Camp. Um, and I'm Chris Marion. I'm the advancement director at Michael Fields Agricultural Institute. We are the parent org of WeWick. And I'm sitting here in beautiful, driftless Southwest Wisconsin in my bedroom, but I'm looking out at my farm. And I do managed grazing of sheep and goats. We've done steers in the past. We're just on 20 acres, but we use our animals to clear invasives. And we now have a sedge meadow where we used to have reed canary grass. Of course, the reed canary grass is happy to come back as soon as the sheep get off. So I'm just going to run real quickly through WeWick. Please scan that QR code to watch the replays of all these webinars. If you're not already following WeWick on Facebook, Instagram, we've got a podcast. You can access all that at wewick.org. And we're just so glad you're here. We are a project of Michael Fields Agricultural Institute. You can learn about us there. We have some other babies that we have birthed over time. Minnesota Women in Conservation, which is run by Renewing the Countryside. I know a lot of you are on from Minnesota today because we have some Minnesota presenters. And then a brand new project is Illinois Women in Conservation. So we would love for you to get involved in real on the ground networks with these groups. And you can just find all of that at michaelfields.org and search under Farmer Networks. We'll get you connected. We've got tons of field days coming up this year. We've already done a bunch of wonderful ones, and we have one tomorrow that's really interesting and different for us. We're touring a home that was built. It's a new build. It was built on an existing restored prairie and conservation forestry project. And we're going to be talking all about how do you build a home with conservation in mind. So we will be inside a lot of tomorrow because it's going to be hot. So join us. Then coming up, we have a Pork on the Prairie field day. April Prusia, who's got Dorothy's Range, she raises heritage hogs on a prairie, and we'll be visiting her place. You can find all these things at wewick.org and register, and you can also donate there. We were a federally supported project. When that funding was terminated, we're now supported by you and a lot of family foundations and wonderful partners. So feel free to donate there. If you become a sustaining donor, you can get one of these awesome bandanas hand drawn by a young woman, and those are part of my sheep in the fall back there. Thank you so much for being here and for your support. Don't forget to sign up for next month's final summer camp on night pollination. And if you're not already on the listserv, getting the newsletter doesn't mean you're on the listserv. The listserv is more an organic email list. Just email us there and we'll put you on. And I'm going to get right to our introductions. We're so delighted today to have two really, really talented women joining us. Xerces Society has actually helped us plan this whole series. And today we have Karin Jokela, who's in Minnesota. She's a pollinator conservation specialist, and Kristen Zumo, who's a range ecologist with Audubon. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, who's going to start us off.
All right, well, let's see how my sharing goes.
Perfect.
You don't want to see how many tabs I have open either. Okay, let me know if that worked correctly. Awesome. Thumbs up. Okay. Well, thank you so much, I guess, to WeWick for having me here and for all of you for joining on. My name is Kristen Zumo. I am a range ecologist with the National Audubon Society. I focus on our conservation ranching program, which you're going to learn a little bit about today. I'm going to go a little bit, I guess, into, what's great with grazing in terms of the birds and the bugs and all of that, and tie them all together. Our conservation ranching program runs basically from the Mississippi River all the way west, and it's grown significantly over the years. I am based out of La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I cover the driftless region as well as a little bit of extensions outward. So I cover the driftless area in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and a little bit of Illinois. So I touch on a couple of different areas of the Midwest here. But so I'm going to get started here. And I guess if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I think we're going to do all of the questions at the end, but I'll get started. Hopefully there we go. So I always kind of like to start some of these conversations with a little bit of a history of North America's grasslands, because the programs that I work in are really highly focused on grassland birds. And the history of the grasslands in North America, they're just really, really tough ecosystems. They can survive extremes from heat waves and cold snaps to torrential downpours and droughts. But they require some kind of disturbance or some kind of turbulence in order to be maintained as grasslands. And so we had previously had over 550 million acres that were maintained through either wildfires, indigenous use of fire, or historically a lot of bison that moved across. And how that kind of functioned was having the bison, they were these large herds that moved across the landscape in a way that they really aerated and broke down the vegetation and ate a lot, left behind a lot of nutrients. And then they moved on and didn't come back for long periods of time. And so what that did was give these long rest periods for the vegetation to recover, but they had really chewed it down in the process of them moving. So obviously we do not have bison here anymore. But the combined forces of all of this really shaped the Great Plains and our grasslands in the Midwest here. And one of the grazing landowners that I work with, I like to put some of their quotes in here because I really feel like they really epitomize what we're doing and why we're doing it. But he shared with me that the fire was a part of that pre-European prairie system, but it was not every year and it was not in every spot. And so the prairie really relied on those hoofed animals, or the bison specifically, to cycle nutrients and disturb that soil. And so nowadays, despite their resilience, barely 1/3 of Central North America historical grasslands are persisting today. So for Minnesota specifically, what that looks like is, and because I worked heavily in Minnesota first with this program, but in Minnesota, what that looks like is this northern tall grass prairie is down to about 4%. Our central tall grass prairie is down to about 3%. And we just don't have that much left. And so North America's tall grass prairie is actually one of the most threatened and fragmented ecosystems worldwide. And it's a huge amount of diversity in those grasslands really resides in insects. So that ties into a lot of what we're talking about here today. And a lot of what's happened over the years in that loss of those grasslands, it really comes down to the land use conversion, whether it be for agricultural purposes, for urbanization, energy development, all of that kind of stuff, as well as tree expansion. So farming and development had really raised about 90% of tall grass prairie, 3/4 of mixed grass prairie, and about half of short grass prairie. And it actually dwarfs what is being seen in the rainforest in terms of the sheer size and scale of the intensity of that loss. And the research that we're seeing in the Great Plains now is really showing a lot of that loss is happening because of this tree expansion. And we're losing, most people don't realize that in the Great Plains area, we're losing as much grassland to expansion of trees and woody encroachment that we are to the land use conversion. It's about 5% each year for both of those. And so what that really means for what I do, and tying into the birds and the insects here, is that as you see on this graph, the grassland birds are some of the steepest declining bird losses that we have in North America. One report in 2019 showed about 53% loss over the past 50 years or 60 years now, maybe. And this report from NABC on the decline of North American birds shows them at about 43%. But either way, they are this steepest decline that we're seeing. And when it comes to insects and the loss of insect diversity, the North American tallgrass prairie ecosystem is one of that, like I mentioned, the most threatened and most fragmented ecosystems in the world. And those insects are a huge part of that loss of diversity. This was a paper that I pulled that talks about the worldwide decline of our insects. But another paper that I found from, I think it was Stoner and Joram in about 2004, stated that in order to maintain our insect biodiversity in these tall grass prairie fragmented areas, conservation practices really need to be focusing on the different types of insect communities. So basically, not just individual species, but the groups that they fall under. So whether they're generalists or specialists, predators, considering multi-life stages. And it's kind of the same way that Audubon is looking at grassland bird conservation in these areas. So we're not just looking at trying to bring back any grassland bird, but we want to make sure that we're hitting the insectivores and the seed eaters and the predators and all of that. So that kind of multifaceted biodiversity there. And so I always kind of like to tie in why grassland birds are so important and why we can focus so heavily on these grassland birds. And first off, they're just really great indicators of ecosystem health. I mean, they really are this canary in the coal mine in a sense of the bird world. They are indicators of that healthy vegetation, of the clean water and healthy soil, pollinator habitat quality, and they're really quick in responding to the loss of those things. So as soon as those are off of the landscape, you're just not going to see the birds there anymore. They're very important for our seed dispersal and consumption of any kind of seeds and other products. They're pest control, both on the insect side of things as well as rodents. And they're just super easy to observe and study. So birds in general are just very easy for people to study and look at. And everybody in my world, I'm always like, well, everybody's got a bird story. The second I tell somebody that I'm working with birds, they immediately have some kind of bird story or something that they want to share. And so they just have this ability to bring people together. So in the next part, one of the things that I like to share, and I developed the next two slides kind of a while ago and popped them into a lot of my presentations, but this, because of that loss of grasslands across North America, what I try to show people is the importance of why we now have to go and start working with all of private landowners, and we want to do anything in terms of bringing back grassland birds and grassland habitats and everything that goes with them. This is a map of the public lands in the United States, and when you overlay that, I can get it to go correctly, with the grasslands, you can see that there's basically very little overlap in terms of public land and our grasslands. So for Audubon, we really had to consider, well, if that's the case, then how are we going to make this impact? And we really decided that this means we're going to have to do a lot of work with private landowners. And so we developed our conservation ranching program. And the whole purpose of this program is really to stabilize declining grassland bird populations by utilizing that partnership with the people who are doing all of the work on these grassland landscapes. So our grazing landowners, because most of the grasslands we have in North America are either in grazing privately or leased. The federal lands are often leased for private or for grazing operations. And so the program that we developed is a market-based solution, in a sense, to try to connect bird-friendly livestock management to the growing consumer demand to know how and where their food comes from. And these consumers then have the power to further drive the demand for the products that are raised in a way that supports these grassland conservation practices. So it's this cyclical sort of system we're trying to build out where conservationists or consumers are really turned into conservationists. And so with the, obviously, as I mentioned, we don't really have the bison here freely roaming anymore. So one of the things that we, again, the landowner that I kind of quoted earlier, made this statement to me is well, you have to look at what was being done before, what nature was doing before man's intervention, before the plow and before us kind of coming in, and you have to try to replicate that. And the big difference between the historical bison grazing and what we do now is that the animals have to return to an area much sooner because landowners don't have, especially in the upper Midwest and such, we don't have hundreds of thousands of acres that they can move across. They're very often on much smaller acreages and paddocks. And so the solution and how you do that is this regenerative or rotational grazing operation where you're moving your animals across the landscape in different patterns to mimic that movement of the bison on the grass. And it can be a vital tool for creating and maintaining those healthy habitats. And how that ties into birds and why it's so important for birds is because just because you identify a species of bird as a grassland bird, it doesn't mean they all want the same thing. So when you're looking at what cattle impacts can be on a grassland habitat, there's going to be this mosaic of different structures and heights of the vegetation as you move your animals across the landscape. And what that does is create this breakup in what kind of grass is out there. So you have these areas maybe that were very recently or very heavily grazed that support species like horned lark or upland sandpipers, or greater prairie chickens and things like that, that want that shorter and potentially sometimes bare ground. The areas that have either been grazed lighter or have just recently been moved through or had a little bit of a rest period support things that like those types of habitats like bobwhites and meadowlarks and things like that. And then there's areas, if you get into light grazing or maybe you defer an area for a year or two, you can support species like Henslow sparrows that want like 2-3 years worth of buildup of thatch and such before they're interested in nesting there. And all of this can be created by moving the cattle across landscape. And so I always kind of like to, being the bird that I am, highlight some of the species here that you see. So like, and these are all farms that, one of the farms that I work with and have written management plans for, where you can see that in some areas where they have kind of grazed down a bit, you're going to be supporting, horned larks and our sandpipers and vesper sparrows and all of that. Going into kind of like your moderate, again, you're going to see your bobolinks, the northern harrier, which is our only grassland nesting raptor in the area. And so you'll see those in kind of like the moderate, a little bit taller grasses, as well as our savanna sparrows and meadowlarks. Then the lighter areas where you're going to have, again, bobolinks kind of come over here. Henslow sparrows really like this. Harriers, there's kind of like this crossover between some of them, but we also have, other types of grassland habitats like our wetlands and our oak savannas that we also pull into the program because just because it's not 100% grass, they are a type of grassland supported habitat. So our oak savannas support our red-headed woodpecker populations who want some of those trees, but still want a good grass component underneath. And our wetlands, which you see cattle grazing in here, also kind of eating down all of the reed canary grass. This particular landowner actually used his cattle to chew down all the reed canary and is now having a lot of natives come up underneath, but support a lot of our nesting duck species in the area. And then, so how do we sell this kind of to the farmers? What are the benefits to the farmers of being a part of programs like this is, rotating their cattle as opposed to maybe going more of a continuous kind of production method is, they're going to have a lot of improved pasture productivity. More rest periods mean that the grass and the vegetation is going to come back better. The soils and water are going to stay on their farm more, which is really good for them. The animals especially are going to have a lot more fresh food all of the time. Most of the landowners that I'm working with are grazing their animals in a pasture for 1 day to maybe 3 days or 4 days max. So that continuous exposure to new and vegetation or fresh vegetation really increases the amount of weight that an animal can put on. They're so much more drought tolerant. I have also landowners that basically only call the vet in when it's time for breeding checks and things like that. Nothing else outside of that. Their animals just don't really seem to get sick. The warm season grasses are really great, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But for the grazing side of it, having some of the warm season native species in their pastures is really great for the warm or the midsummer slump, where our cool season grasses are just not producing enough to have animals put on weight. The increased vegetative cover increases with heat stress, and there's less time and input than conventional farming. So it's really, really beneficial for a landowner to kind of move towards these methods. For the birds and the insects, which is, obviously what we're interested on our side, is the use of those animals to create that mosaic of healthy habitats, those different structures and heights, because a lot of grassland birds are more interested in what that structure looks like than they are a specific species. Obviously, that's different for insects, which I'll kind of get into as well in a second, but there is that indirect effect on the insect community through that plant community manipulation as well. And then there's also a lot of less chemical inputs are usually way better for those insects for food for our birds as well. That same article that I mentioned, that Stoner and Jorn identified that plant species composition, plant biomass, abundance of blooming flowers, and vertical habitat heterogeneity, so that mosaic that's created by the vegetation and the grazing through this vegetation are really what influences the insect diversity on that landscape. And that rotational grazing can really help to create that diversity in those attributes and provide for greater species diversity. And this also helps to avoid any kind of habitat sink, which I'll explain in a second as well. So in one of the things that we kind of come up across in the upper Midwest here is that most of our pastures are planted to non-native cool season grasses and legumes, making them pretty significantly lower in diversity. And while birds will still nest in these areas and in these pastures, they often end up, like I said, creating these habitat sinks, meaning that even if the birds are utilizing it, and even if they're choosing to nest in it, their survival and their recruitment are going to often be lower, which means that they've put all this energy into nesting in this area that they just can't, they don't have the ability to survive in. And from the insect perspective, many native insects are specialized to one genus or even a species of plant. And so without those native plants, they won't even try. And the way that these two things kind of tie together, that habitat sink and the insects, is that without these insects, a bird that has a successful nest, maybe they chose an area in these kind of non-native kind of locations, they've nested in it, they've sat on it, the eggs have hatched, but then they don't have enough food to provide to the nestlings or to the fledglings when they leave for them to survive. Because those first few weeks after eggs hatch, those babies need about 26 to 30% crude protein in order to develop properly. And so if they don't have that insect diversity and they don't have the insects, they often will end up, the broods will just fail, even if the nest is successful. And so we try to talk to some of our landowners about the benefits of those native forages. And I know Karen's going to get a lot more into the, I hate to say it, into the weeds on this later, but the native grasses are just so much more drought tolerant. The warm seasons help fill that summer slump for the cattle. They require little to no fertilizer or any kind of treatments, and the benefits to the soil and everything and the insects is just so significant that we're trying to get some of our landowners to kind of move more in this direction, at least starting with a pasture or two when they have to reinvigorate a pasture, trying out some of the more native species. And so I'll kind of touch on some of the things that we recommend the farmers and the grazers that we work with to try to improve some of the habitat for birds and insects through their grazing operation. And so one of the things that we do is we talk about resting options. So choosing paddocks that are contiguous versus resting paddocks that are really far apart creates a more specific contiguous habitat for them. So say instead of, with this landowner that I'm working with, he actually rests this whole central area during the breeding season for birds, and he just rotates around here. And once they get out of that main breeding season, then he'll move animals into here. So that larger contiguous block is really great for creating good habitat. We recommend setting aside a pasture for the end of the summer. That kind of allows a little bit more buildup in that pasture to support the species that aren't, wanting that shorter, heavily grazed type of grasses. And we also recommend rotating where you actually start. So like you don't want to start grazing at one each year and go around the same circle, because as you're doing that, if you're grazing the same area at the same time of year every single year, what you're doing is you're supporting a very specific type of species in that area. And so over time, you're going to end up actually decreasing your diversity in that area. So we might say maybe one year you start in year 1 and you go around the circle. Next year you start in year 2, go around the circle, maybe start in year 7, go around the circle. But starting at a different point each year really helps keep up the diversity in your grasses. Harvesting options for hay and such for wildlife, we recommend, instead of coming from the outside and circling in, where you're going to trap all of the animals on the inside and then they have nowhere to go, either start on the edge of the field or come to the center and work your way out, giving animals kind of an escape route from there. We recommend leaving some kind of refugia so that maybe you're not haying an area. Down here, I even have maybe delaying hay on about 50% until after that breeding season. With grazing, we let people graze some areas down lower, but we recommend more of leaving like an 8 to 12 inches behind as they're rotating animals instead of going down to like 4 inches on every single paddock. And at the end of the year, you can leave about 8 inches or so. And what that does is actually create really great supportive habitat in the early nesting season in the following year. Instead of having everything go down to 4 or 6 inches, say in November or so. If you leave some areas that are a bit taller, those areas will recover a lot better the coming spring and provide even better habitat earlier in the year. I like to show this, and I'll run through this quickly, but we often get a question as to why we have July 1st or June 1st through like July 15th as like a timeline for the bird nesting. And so I kind of like to give this little breakdown to folks where this is kind of the series in which a bird goes through in order to complete a nest. First, they're locating the area. They go through nest building, which can take up to a week depending on the species of bird. Then they go through the egg laying. They lay about 1 egg a day. And if they have 4 to 5 eggs, it can take, obviously 4 to 5 days. And then they're incubating for a period of 7 to 14 days, depending on the species. Then once they hatch, they're in the nest for another 7 to 14 days, depending on the species. And then the brood is kind of hanging out in that area. So if you break that down into a calendar view, it kind of shows you why we want to have this at minimum of 6-week period, protecting areas for birds to nest in. Then a couple of more things that kind of bring in the insect side of things a bit better and some of the other survival things a bit better. We definitely recommend a reduction in herbicide. This goes back to that birds needing 26, or the fledglings needing 26% of crude protein in those early weeks. We don't allow broadcast herbicide in the program unless under very specific circumstances. Maybe they're trying to bring a new pasture online or restore a prairie or something like that. But we generally, and we definitely have restrictions on neonics as well, because we know how bad they are for our insects, and we want to protect those insects on these grasslands. One thing that we get a lot of questions on is we often recommend removing any kind of fence rows. And that goes into the grassland bird mindset where they like visually open big spaces. And it's because they know that with these tree lines, and especially as you see in like all around the upper Midwest and in other areas, is that fence rows often end up with these very distinctive vertical tree lines running through them. Those are basically highways for predators. So there's been a lot of research done on this where grassland bird densities increase in areas where you take out these tree rows. And this is a project that we supported through some of our grants, where this tree row came out, and look how much deeper and fuller this grassland is going to be now. But nesting densities increased in these areas, while nest success didn't necessarily increase because there's more nesting attempts in the area. You're getting more survival or higher survival rates. The second you take out these tree lines, the woodland associated predators decrease, like our raccoons, and opossums and skunks and all of that just view those tree lines as highways. And then there's a 9-fold kind of increase or decrease in those raccoons. And so doing a simple thing like taking out these tree lines creates such intensively improved habitat for nesting birds. So we're not against planting trees in places. We just recommend folks do it kind of in a way that the siting is really important. And then in the native pastures, we are trying to encourage more people to do these conversions to the native pastures, where you have the warm season bunch grasses that are easier for chicks to get around. You have diverse plantings of forbs, native forbs, that create a whole bunch more habitat for the insects that then provide that protein. And then they also, obviously, with our natives, I'm sure everybody's seen all of these images of the depths of the roots that some of these native forbs and grasses can go to, and how much that improves your soil and water retention, and just how the carbon sequestration, everything that comes along with that. And so with the conservation ranching program, what we're really trying to do here is pull all of that together. And as I mentioned, make consumers turn these consumers into the conservationists. And you don't have to read through all of these protocols. These are just kind of the general. We have multiple pages of protocols that we work with landowners through. But the general idea is that they have to meet these protocols. And then I work individually with a landowner in order to create an individualized habitat management plan for them. And taking that management plan alongside our protocols, we then bring that to our third-party auditor, who then goes and certifies the farm as being basically bird-friendly habitat. And then they get this lovely label that they can put on all of their beef and bison products that shows up in stores, and consumers can go find that label and say, yes, I know that this animal, this product was raised in a way that supports our grasslands and our birds and our insects, and I want to support them. And so that's what we're trying to get folks to do. And just one last slide here. I know I'm running out of time. We don't just say that this program is doing what we claim it's doing. We have a lot of data and science that goes behind that. And one part of that is our bird friendliness index. And what we do with that is we do bird surveys on all of the certified properties that I work with. And we compare those to surveys that are being done on non-certified lands. And we can compare the two to see whether or not the practices we're putting in place are actually moving the needle forward for grassland birds. And so some of the data that we've gotten so far is that over the first 8 years or so of the program, there was an 8.4% increase per year in grassland bird abundance or the increase in this bird friendliness index over that first 8 years. So we are seeing this trend of they are doing better on our certified lands than on grazing lands that are not certified. And another part of that is that there's about 60% of our focal grassland bird species that are doing better on these conservation ranches regionally. And so this is the kind of data where we're trying to pull in and show that, yes, doing these grassland practices and grazing in this way is really important in supporting our birds and our wildlife and our insects. And with that, I will close out and leave it. And this is just a quote I kind of really enjoy, obviously being, from the land of Aldo Leopold up here. The landscape of any farm is the owner's portrait of himself. And I really have just, that has been so exemplified in all the producers that I work with, is that all they want to do is care for their land in the best way possible. And so it's really been amazing to have this position and be able to work with people who consider that is their motto. And so I'll leave my information here, and I think we're going to do questions at the end, but I will hand it over. I'll stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Karin once I figure out where the button is.
Thank you, Kristen. Okay. You can see my screen, right? Okay. Great. Hi, everybody. I am Karin Jokela. I'm really excited to be here, and I feel like I have to preface so many talks by saying I have an irresponsible number of slides in here for the amount of time I've been given, but there's so many fun things to talk about. So, thankfully, Kristen did a really nice job of covering some of the content that I wanted to share. So I'll zoom through some of that and try to make sure we can get time for questions. I also just wanted to note here that I've been in my role at the Xerces Society for 9 years, and I participated in some women's learning circles in Wisconsin before WeWiC was a formal organization. And I just have to say, I was welcomed. I'm in Minnesota, but I was welcomed so warmly into the Wisconsin private lands network and farmers. And I always, whenever I talk about grazing, I always feel so much imposter syndrome because I'm watching the chat, I'm looking at these familiar names, I'm thinking how many people in this room have so much knowledge. And it's really, anyway, I really love this model. I'm really honored to be here to talk about a few things that I find fascinating about grazing and invertebrates. I also wanted to just note this title. So invertebrates in the pasture, I kind of added in this subtitle, the plant diversity can create healthy livestock for insects, but also thinking of it as an invitation to, as a verb, plant diversity for all of these things. All right, is that gonna move forward? I don't know, maybe not. Okay. A little bit about my role. So I am a pollinator conservation specialist with Xerces. I won't say more about Xerces because I hope, and I know Kat did a really nice job explaining what we do as an organization. My general role is to serve farmers and the conservation staff who serve farmers to see insect habitat, design insect habitat, assess it, manage it, and all things kind of vegetation for insects. But before I was a pollinator specialist, I was a grazing enthusiast. So right out of college, I was really enchanted by this idea. I was reading this book, The Farm is Natural Habitat, written by some Upper Midwest authors and thinkers, and really loved this idea that grazing systems can marry agricultural production and ecological restoration. And that has just been a driving force for everything I did since. And it was working on this farm, this grass-fed beef farm in Northeast Iowa, where I was trying out some of Temple Grandin's ideas, and I was running around moving cattle all the time. And on the front of the four-wheeler, I was running into all these insects and realizing, wow, these little things really make the world run. Even dying animals can just be turned over into earth very, very quickly because of insects. And later on, it was that discovery of the life in grazing systems that I think led me into conservation biology and entomology. So anyway, all this to say, I'm not a grazing specialist. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a vet. I'm a grazing enthusiast and an insect plant interaction kind of community ecologist, but I love grazing systems. And so in graduate school, I did study patchburn grazing in Iowa, and the insect responses to that. And now on my farm in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, I still deploy fire and grazing to maximize biodiversity on farms here and elsewhere. Okay. So the way I wanted to structure my talk here is one, to say a few things about some recent Xerces work that has to do with grazing and biodiversity, and then kind of zoom in on those little things. And the second part, and the third part is sort of like ideas, practical suggestions, more wearing my farmer hat, about how I think there's some easy-ish ways to slowly but surely be increasing biodiversity for insects in grazing systems. So I would say, I wear lots of hats. At the beginning, I would say pretty Xerces, and then I sort of like move down towards a personal hat. Okay, but at Xerces, we really believe that invertebrates are the heart of all healthy landscapes. They're the life that supports us all. And we are completely dependent on these invertebrates that do all these services, and not just services, they're just doing this. This is just their lives. And it creates stability and balance and interest and function for all of us on the landscape. And recently, and maybe in the last decade, we've really been, and as Kristen showed, that the upper Midwest, the Great Plains, are privately owned, but there's so much conservation potential there in these large grasslands, that unfortunately a lot of people, grazers or farmers or ranchers or people who manage land with livestock, whatever you might call yourself, they have perceptions about flowers, that flowers aren't forage, grasses are forage. Flowers just take up space that otherwise would be forage. And so there's quite a few private grasslands in the upper Midwest that routinely get sprayed out of those forbs. So Xerces and many partners, federal and institutional like NDSU, put together this research program to understand what flowers really contribute to livestock health. So, yes, just going without saying, like, livestock actually do use forbs. Maybe it's not the bulk of their forage, but to varying degrees, different livestock, different breeds, different livestock culture, they use forbs for some part of their diet in different seasons. Even things that are not strictly thought of as forage, like milkweeds, they do use. So given all of this context and the high potential for bringing pollinator conservation into these large tracts of grasslands, Xerces and partners designed this study to assess wildflower forage quality. So they sampled, and I wasn't part of the initial sampling. I'm just the messenger for some good work that my coworkers have done. But they sampled wildflowers, like 100 different species across a large range, species that we thought would be valuable to pollinators, that are pretty abundant, that maybe even grazers think might be palatable. And when we sampled the vegetation, we sampled those flowers pre-flowering, during flower, and post-flowering, because anybody who grazes pasture knows that the forage quality changes over time. So the sampling effort from 2021 to 2024 kind of went across this whole range here, and I understand that my coworker Kat in Wisconsin is going to be foraging, collecting even more forage samples in Wisconsin this year to kind of fill out that picture from the eastern part of the tallgrass prairie. A couple missing species maybe. And so we basically assessed a few normal measurements that other grasses that we know, forage grasses, to create some kind of like parity in the science, in the literature. Like, well, we know this about grasses, but we don't know this about wildflowers. So we assessed crude protein, total digestible nutrients, various macrominerals, microminerals, and so forth. And from that big data set, there will be many publications. The first one to come out that's very user-friendly only features 19 of that large data, 19 species of that large data sets for the northern Great Plains. You can find this online as a digital copy, but there are also hard copies circulating. Let me know if you feel like you need some copies. And basically, it's kind of an ID guide. For each species that's featured in there are 2 pages, kind of like any plant ID guide, giving you some tips on what it looks like, what generally the forage quality is. The first page features the crude protein and the total digestible nutrients data measured against. So the red line there is your average warm season grass forage value, and the blue value is cool season grasses. And so you can see with almost every one of these floral or forb species, they were having higher nutrition. The second page for each species looks like this, where there's some macrominerals, microminerals, and some insects that benefit from that plant. I will note that because this is for a Wisconsin audience, the map in here is a little annoying to me. It doesn't show the true extent of that species range. It just shows this MLRA, which is Major Land Resource Area. In fact, the neon green here on this map is the true extent of lead plant, and that's the same for all the species in there. So lots of, take that with a grain of salt. Okay, zooming through. Kristen did a great job of explaining, there's all this decline of insects. I wanted to highlight this one quote from E.O. Wilson, famous entomologist. 30 years ago, he wrote, "The evidence is overwhelming that wild pollinators are declining. Their ranks are being thinned not just by habitat reduction and other familiar agents of impoverishment, but also by the disruption of the delicate biofabric of interactions that bind ecosystems together." And I love that biofabric imagery because I'm going to try to give you more illustrations of that biofabric in the next few slides. So simple systems don't create a lot of insects or a lot of wildlife. The more diversity you have at the plant level, the more complex a system you have in the food chain. Kristen already mentioned this, but the vast majority of our insects that are feeding on plants are specialists to some extent. So when you don't invite these insects to the habitat by planting their host plants, we just have fewer insects in general. So lots of diversity out there. And then there's this idea of the microbiome, and it's kind of a fancy word, but it really just means small habitats, right? We have a small habitat in our gut. We have a small habitat on our skin. Everything out there has small habitats, small microbiomes. So consider the plant microbiome. There's a microbiome on the surface, inside the plant, and in the root rhizosphere, right? Invertebrates play this essential role in our environment, being the vehicles for those microbes, moving things around, up and down plants, from flowers down into the soil, all over the environment. Invertebrates on top of invertebrates, right? They're bringing all of this stuff around into the environment. And I probably should have cut this out, but it really resonates with me as somebody who's had an experience of antibiotic resistance for a skin infection. It really scares me that we're losing so much of this biofabric of health. And there's definitely evidence that with reduced exposure to diverse microorganisms, we have negative health consequences. So this is a paper from almost 10 years ago, kind of just putting out a hypothetical framework that we really could restore our microbiome and biodiversity by bringing in native plants, more diversity in our environment. So in my interpretation is that we all need to be sniffing, consuming, and tending to more biodiversity. So just to go back to this guide for a second, zooming in on just one species. So this is the insect part of it, right? So the guide looks like this. It just has these basic symbols about who the insects are, but that's not enough for me, the insect lover. So I wanted to look into this one species that's almost, it's so common, it's kind of like disparaged for being so common. It attracts over 88 different species of butterflies and moths. It's an important nectar source for so many different insects. It feeds lots of birds, even mammal herbivores, and so forth. There are all these different really fascinating insects with their own life histories, their own microbiomes on their bodies, with like really, they're just they're using the nectar resources and then going out and eating livestock pests. They're doing really amazing things. I wish I could tell the stories of all of these right now, but I'm watching the time. And then there's parasitoids. So each one of those insects that I showed you, it's hypothesized that for each invertebrate species out there, there's at least one parasitoid wasp that lives inside of that species at one point in its life cycle. Sometimes multiple, like a parasitoid might specialize on this one insect during its larval stage, and another one might parasitize it during its adult stage. So there's so much complexity with insects out there. And interestingly, with these parasitoids, they often need floral resources for their adult stage so that they can fuel more parasitizing for their young. And so this is where I'm starting to move into personal views, but I have 2 young kids, and I discovered this little book series, Tiny Habitats by Amy Hevron. And this is the kind of world that I want to live in and that I think grazing lands can provide, which is just this party of life. And if we know from Doug Talmey's work that breeding chickadees need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed their young. These are little birds. They're maybe 9 grams as an adult. A baby pheasant chick is about 18 grams, twice that. So they need that many more bugs in their environment. The reason all these birds migrate up here is for the bugs, right? So this is the kind of world I want to live in. And this is what has driven me personally on my farm to try to integrate more and more diversity into grazing systems. So I want to make this case that I think is a little bit novel for private lands restoration, which is that a lot of us think about seeding a prairie or seeding pollinator habitat like once or planting it once. But I think I'm trying to shift and poke at that paradigm a little bit to bring the idea that maybe we should keep introducing propagules over time. It's fun, and there's a lot of opportunities when you have grazing, especially on fire. There's a lot of ways to get species in that maybe you wouldn't have in the first go because of cost or whatever. There's a lot of reason to keep doing this. Xerces wrote a whole book not a book, but it's a guide on this about how to do it, what are the best candidate species for getting these flowers in, which one from research and peer-reviewed literature and just like practitioner information. The 3 key steps is basically to suppress the grass, introduce the forb, and then continue to suppress the grass for at least 1 season. That's the way it boils down, but there's a lot more detail in the guide. So this is just some of the ways that I have done it on our farm. Here's a prairie that unfortunately I planted with too much of the warm season aggressive grasses like big bluestem Indian grass and switchgrass. So we hayed off that vegetation. We use the hay for winter feed for our goats. Then I had the goats come in and continue to eat off that. And then I interseeded in the fall, in the winter, some of these species that were missing from my original mix. So I encourage you to introduce maybe these 3 species or some others. These are really workhorse species. They're relatively affordable, established pretty easily, meet these different bloom periods that could provide forage for insects and livestock. And there's a lot of creative ways to do this for virtually free, but a little bit of labor, building your own small nurseries and outplanting. We have done this on our farm. I know this is a bit of a messy, colorful map, but the idea is basically that we have these plots in all different locations on the farm that we manage for refugia, but also seed. And that seed drifts into other parts of the farm. I collect it, and then I move it down into this natural area just south of the farm that used to be oak savanna, no longer is, but we're working to get it back. So what we are doing is bringing our animals, our small herd of goats. I could use hundreds of goats, but unfortunately I only have 10. So we're moving our animals through to hit the invasive brush during the summer. We're doing often fall burns and then interseeding. And then this is just a chronological like photo essay that this is sort of a rinse and repeat process. And I'm largely using seed that I grew in other parts of the farm to keep introducing those propagules into these spaces. So again, you can see those seeds coming up the next year. And we've got more summer grazing, burning, interseeding. You've got those crunchy leaves from the oak leaf litter drop. This is just year after year. It's a never-ending stewardship project. Sometimes we do use herbicide following the goats to keep certain trees under control. Just keeps going and going. You can see that canopy, sub canopy of buckthorn that the goats are trying to kill with them stripping down the bark. But then I will go and basil bark that plant. So just to wrap things up here, I'm watching the time. This is like the dry summary. Basically, plant diverse species, manage for a lot of different blooms, plan for some spaces that might have longer rest, have some tall vegetation, some short vegetation, some things in between, and reduce pesticides that could kind of break that delicate biofabric of interactions that bind our ecosystems together. So that's kind of the summary. We have tons of resources at xerces.org, all downloadable PDFs to share and to learn. And then we have people on the ground that can come help advise. And I think that's what I had. If I go to the next slide, it might show you some of my, oh no, okay. That's really the end slide. I probably have like 40 other slides that I couldn't fit in. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Karin. That was so awesome. I'm so excited to dig into some of those resources. And yeah, I don't know, should we plan another follow-up? Because you have so much cool stuff going on. Thank you. We had a very engrossed audience. We only had a few questions, which is great if people need to get on to their next thing. But I'm gonna just express those both to Kristen and Karin, and I'm sure you can tackle them in your own. They weren't too specific, and I think maybe one was answered in Kristen's presentation, but it was regarding like vegetation height. What I think you gave recommendations, but like what is bare defined as in a recently grazed pasture? Like, or maybe what could happen if it gets too grazed or something like that.
Yeah, there's actually the ability to grass. So, I mean, as I mentioned in some of the earlier slides, the grasslands are so incredibly tolerant and resilient. And so there's a new, not necessarily new, I guess, but some folks are starting to go towards what's called total grazing, which is where they're actually taking a pasture and they are really hammering it down, but then they don't touch it at all for the next year, which is, and it reinvigorates a lot of the vegetation and stuff that's there because it's something that that grassland hasn't experienced for a long time. And so all of that to say, like, you can graze these pastures to all different types of heights. You can graze them down to bare ground, but it's that rest period that really matters. So as long as they get a long enough period of rest afterwards, you can do a lot with them and really start to bring back a lot of the biodiversity in them. So we try to work with our landowners to kind of include a whole variation on their landscape if they have the acres for it. So some areas maybe they can graze really low, or some acres, maybe they should defer for a year or so, and everything in between. So it really depends on what works for them and how we manage it in a way to make sure that no matter what they're grazing it to, it gets that proper rest period afterwards. And those different types of treatments can bring back different species of grass and forbs and everything. So it's all about mixing and matching.
Awesome. Thank you. Someone, a specific question. Well, let's see. Tabitha asked about bison integration. I think specifically tribal work to bring these animals back to the land. But I know there's other organizations, institutions, and farmers possibly doing that work too. I'm curious if either of you could speak to the reintegration of bison as land managers.
Yes, so very little. So I haven't worked with any of the tribes yet. I do know we have been going to some of their own conferences and discussions and such, and there are a handful both in Minnesota and in Wisconsin that are bringing bison back to the land. And then there's some of them that are kind of bringing, like, they're working alongside like the Nature Conservancy and other things like that to bring bison to those areas as well. So for the grazing period of the year. I can't remember. I don't want to say the wrong the wrong tribes that are doing this, but I know both in Wisconsin and Minnesota there are ones that are bringing bison back. I don't know if
Yeah,
more.
I think there are a few. The one I know for sure, and then the other, well, is Shakopee, Mdewakanton Sioux community. But I know there's another one in northern Minnesota that has introduced, I think there's even like an NRCS kind of video that you could find on YouTube about this process, and it's very inspiring. And so, yes, definitely being brought back in really thoughtful ways in Minnesota. And I'm less familiar with Wisconsin.
Thank you. And then one final question, unless anyone else has anything they'd like to add or come off mute, but for Karin, have you thought of or compared a plot of just basil treated versus goats filed by basil for efficacy? Maybe wondering about the impact of the goat stress.
Yeah, so I learned very quickly that goats are no silver bullet and really can only be thought of as a part of a package. The only thing they really help me do is gain access to spaces in a methodical way that I otherwise would have maybe just chosen my favorite places to steward, but instead they're moving me through a space, and that after they clear some vegetation, I can do the next step. And so there have been places that I just basil bark some things, but then I've got standing dead trees that vines climb up, and it's still too thick to achieve kind of the outcomes I want. And so I just can't imagine not having goats as a tool to come through and keep kind of like letting light down and allowing it to be fire ready. And so they really have not set back buckthorn on their own. They're really just letting me in.
Well, oh, we got one here. Why are woody perennials encroaching on tall grass prairie?
This goes back to the disturbance and how grasslands have to have some kind of disturbance in order to be maintained as grasslands. So we don't have a lot of fire. We've kind of limited fire. We don't have the bison anymore. And those were the two historical main ways that grasslands had some kind of disturbance. And so when you remove those, it allows all of that woody encroachment to slowly creep in and take its place.
I would add two things. One is sort of just piggybacking on what you're saying, which is that, we don't have a lot of livestock on old pasture anymore. And some of that pasture used to have little pockets of remnant vegetation that was prairie. Instead, we've moved them off the farm into, lots. And so there's just fewer fewer animals out on the land. And so those lands, if it's not cropland, it basically is ignored until hunting season, like once a year. So there's just like not eyes on that spot. And that fosters woody encroachment. There's also just environmental changes, and there's more nutrient deposition. There's just more fertility that's really favoring woody species and cool season grasses that are non-native. So great. Yeah, so the we're kind of prairies have a tough, it's like a green glacier to work against.
Yes, that is the term.
But there's a follow-up question to that. If you notice any ecosystem carbon storage implications in woody perennials versus tall grass prairie?
That is a great question. And so forests have a tendency to get a lot of the credit for carbon storage because they have so much biomass, but their biomass is all above the ground, so we can see it. But when it comes to carbon storage in prairies, all of their biomass is below the ground and it really holds on tight. So when you think of, everybody talks about forest loss and the implications there for carbon, storage loss and everything. So when a wildfire comes through a forested area, for example, you lose a lot of that carbon storage, but then it also takes 30 years or more just to get back to where it was before the fire. And then it can start adding carbon sequestration from there. But when it comes to a prairie, because most of the carbon is below the surface, when a fire comes through there, it doesn't damage a lot of the carbon storage that's there, and the vegetation respawns a lot faster and heals a lot faster. So the potential for carbon storage in prairies is just unbelievable. So I mean, forests are fantastic for carbon storage. I'm not trying to knock on them for that, but I just try to bring to light the knowledge that prairies are just as important for carbon storage. And as we're moving forward in like climate shifts and everything that we're seeing and seeing more of these wildfires, we're going to lose a lot more of that carbon storage through the woodlands and the fires going through there, versus if we're supporting prairie, there's a lot more ability to maintain and keep that carbon in place. I don't know if Karin wants to add to that. But
That is beautifully said. But I would also just kind of, Xerces is frequently reminding people that biodiversity conservation and ecological resilience and climate resilience are intrinsically linked. And so we don't want to turn the world into all forests. We want the biodiversity of all these places, these unique features that have the unique microbiomes, the unique plants, the unique insects that have treasures, that, gifts that we haven't even learned about. And so just, yeah, I think that the actual carbon kind of story that you explained, Kristen, is great, but also that biodiversity will help us get through, these climate, changes.
they each have their very important places.
Well, what an amazing presentation. A lot to digest, and a diversity of things to digest, which is just what we want. I hope that you all will sign up to continue this good learning. We have one more of these, and it'll be very fun on night pollination. So please scan that QR code. Let's see everybody back here. And thank you so much, Karin and Kristen. Amazing. Truly amazing. Thank you.
I will just say, Emily is a gifted speaker and storyteller and scientist. So definitely join. She's amazing.
Well, we can't wait. This has been such an incredible series, and you all are really amazing. Thank you so much.